George was supposed to add to Thurman's money and take him to the same level. And Thurman and I had a meeting, and I told him what I was made a comment that they turned into this straw that stirs the drink. Something was attributed to me that I did not say, that Thurman could only stir it badly.
Thurman Munson was a champion, but these are the 5 MLB stars he could never forgive. He never left behind a clean list with 5 names anywhere. This ranking comes from the fights, feuds, and hard feelings found throughout his whole career, built only from what the record actually shows here today. Munson was captain of the New York Yankees, the first man to hold that title since Lou Gehrig, and in 1976 he won the American League Most Valuable Player award. He led his team to 2 World Series titles, playing through pain that would have ended most careers. As the heat starts to rise, use the hype feature now and give this video some hype. Yet the same fire that made him a champion also made him one of the hardest men in baseball to work with. He pushed his teammates hard, he clashed with the people running his team, and he almost never backed down from a fight. That is the contradiction sitting at the heart of this whole story. Munson helped build a true winner, but his temper also left real marks on the people closest to him. The Yankees of the late 1970s played inside a wild and unstable clubhouse that reporters nicknamed the Bronx Zoo. Big egos, big money, and a hungry New York press, all mixed together in one dugout. Munson stood right in the middle of it, and he rarely walked away from a clash. He was blunt, he was proud, and he always expected everyone around him to match his effort on the field. When teammates or bosses did not meet that standard, he let them know it, often loudly. This countdown ranks the 5 men who brought out the darkest, most bitter side of Thurman Munson, moving from the mildest clash all the way to the deepest wound. Some of these men wore the same pinstripes as Munson. Others wore a rival uniform and became a lasting symbol of everything he hated about losing. Each name on this list reveals a different piece of his temper, and together they show why Munson was so hard to forget. It starts with a teammate who shared many of the very same values that Munson held close. A man who still found himself on the wrong end of the captain's sharp temper more than once, even though their fight was never truly personal. Number 5 on this list is Graig Nettles, the Yankees' third baseman who stood beside Munson for years. Nettles and Munson were not enemies in any normal sense of the word. They were veteran teammates who shared many of the same values, and in a strange way their friction proves just how demanding Munson could be, even with a man who mostly agreed with him. Both players always demanded full effort from everyone on the roster. Both were outspoken, and neither man cared much for keeping quiet when something bothered him. Both were skeptical of the press and the growing culture around free agency, viewing much of it as shallow or self-serving. Both helped set the standards inside that Yankees clubhouse, and both were willing to confront a teammate directly if they thought he was cutting corners. Nettles was not a man who backed down easily either. He had his own strong opinions about how the game should be played, and he was not afraid to share them, whether teammates wanted to hear them or not. That made him a natural match for Munson in some ways, since neither man liked being told what to do without a good reason behind it. But it also meant that when the two of them disagreed, the disagreement rarely stayed quiet for long. That shared toughness is exactly where the trouble started. 2 strong personalities holding the same high standards will eventually clash over how those standards get enforced. Munson and Nettles disagreed at times over authority, over communication, and over how the team should handle its internal problems. Munson wanted things handled his way, on his terms, and he did not always make room for another loud voice in that clubhouse, even one that usually agreed with him. This is exactly where Munson's leadership could turn controlling and hard to manage. He was the captain, and he acted like it every single day. When Nettles pushed back, even gently, Munson could grow sharp and short with him. Their disagreements were rarely about a single explosive moment. Instead, they built up slowly, through small arguments about strategy, about accountability, and about who really had the final say when a problem needed fixing inside that locker room. Both men had watched the game change quickly around them, as free agency brought new money and new attention into a sport that used to run on a simpler kind of loyalty. Munson and Nettles were both suspicious of how that changing culture affected the clubhouse, and both worried that big new contracts could pull a team apart if nobody held the group accountable. That shared worry was part of what bonded them, even as it also gave them one more thing to argue about. It would be wrong to say Nettles hated Munson or that their friction threatened to tear the team apart. Nothing in the record suggests a lasting grudge between the two men. Their relationship was part of the larger accountability culture that helped the Yankees win, a culture built on strong men holding each other to a brutal standard. Nettles pushed back when he had to, and Munson pushed back just as hard, and somehow the team still won. That is really the whole lesson buried inside this entry. Munson could create friction even with a teammate who agreed with him about almost everything that mattered. His need to control the room, to be the loudest and most demanding voice in it, meant that even a fellow tough guy like Nettles sometimes found himself on the wrong end of the captain's temper. It was never personal, and it never truly became hatred, but it was real, and it showed a side of Munson that was hard to soften or explain away. Nettles later stood beside Munson during some of the ugliest moments of the Reggie Jackson controversy, snubbing the new star together during a televised competition. That loyalty says something important. Whatever friction existed between Munson and Nettles, it never stopped them from standing together when a bigger threat entered the clubhouse. Their disputes were the normal wear and tear of two proud men sharing the same locker room for years on end. Disputes between two veteran teammates who mostly respect each other are one thing. Challenging the man actually running the team from the dugout is something else entirely, and it placed Munson in a much more dangerous position. Nettles could push back at Munson, and the two of them could still share a laugh in the dugout an hour later. A manager rarely offered that same kind of forgiveness. That is where this story turns next, toward the manager who named him captain and then had to deal with everything that came with it, day after day, season after season. Number 4 is Billy Martin, the manager who both trusted Munson completely and fought with him constantly. Martin took over as Yankees manager in August of 1975, and he recognized right away that Munson was the true leader of that team. Before the 1976 season began, Martin named him captain, believing that Munson had the confidence and the toughness needed to run a major league dugout from the inside. Martin relied on his catcher as an extension of himself on the field, trusting him to carry out a game plan even under enormous pressure. Martin publicly praised the choice, telling reporters that Munson had exactly the kind of toughness a dugout needed. That public support meant something in a clubhouse full of strong personalities, because it told everyone else on the roster that the captain spoke for the manager, and that his word carried real weight, even when Martin himself was not standing in the room. That trust came with a price. Martin managed with an intense, unpredictable style that placed extreme pressure on every player who wore the pinstripes. He pushed hard, he changed his mind quickly, and he demanded total loyalty even when his own decisions seemed reckless. Munson was one of the very few players on that roster willing to challenge him directly. Behind closed doors, away from reporters and cameras, Munson questioned tactical choices he disagreed with, and he was not shy about saying so to the manager's face. Munson also acted as a buffer between Martin and the rest of the roster, absorbing some of the manager's anger so it did not land on younger or less established players. That role required real courage, since Martin was known for turning on people quickly and without warning. Their relationship worked because it was built on honesty rather than easy agreement. Munson would tell Martin exactly what he thought, and Martin, in his own way, respected that kind of bluntness even when it frustrated him. Seen through a critical lens, Munson's willingness to speak up cuts two ways. It protected teammates from a manager who could be unpredictable and harsh, but it also reflected something deeper about Munson himself, a belief that his judgment deserved to be heard at every level of the organization, from the clubhouse floor all the way up to the manager's office. He was not just defending his teammates. He was asserting his own authority, making sure that no decision happened without his voice in the room. One clash between the two men centered on Munson's private jet. Munson liked flying himself between New York and his home in Ohio during the season, a habit that let him see his family more often. Martin strongly disapproved of the practice and raised serious safety concerns directly with George Steinbrenner, worried that the risk was too great for a player as important as his captain. After Munson's death, Martin testified in legal proceedings that he had personally tried to talk Munson out of flying so often, showing just how seriously he had taken the danger. Nothing in the record suggests that Martin ever predicted the tragedy that would follow, and no specific shouting match over the plane is documented beyond his stated concern and his later testimony. What is clear is that Martin worried, and Munson kept flying anyway, unwilling to let anyone tell him how to spend his own time away from the ballpark. That stubborn independence was part of what made Munson so effective as a leader, and it was also part of what made him difficult to manage. Despite every argument, the mutual respect between Martin and Munson survived. Martin depended on his captain as his tactical partner on the field, and Munson depended on Martin's willingness to let him speak his mind without punishment. Their alliance was filled with fights, built on two stubborn men who rarely agreed quietly, yet it held together through 3 straight American League pennants and 2 World Series championships in 1977 and 1978. Reporters who covered the team often struggled to understand how a manager and a captain who argued so often could keep winning at such a high level, but the answer was simple. Neither man cared about being liked. Both men cared only about winning, and every argument between them was really just another version of that same shared obsession. It proved that conflict, handled the right way, could actually strengthen a team instead of destroying it. Martin's own job security was never fully guaranteed either, since Steinbrenner hired and fired managers quickly during this era, and Munson understood that his own standing as captain gave him a stability that Martin himself did not always enjoy. But managing a manager is one kind of challenge. Managing the man who signed the checks, approved the contracts, and controlled the entire organization from above was something else entirely, and that challenge would test Munson far more deeply than anything Billy Martin ever threw at him, in ways that touched his pride, his paycheck, and his sense of his own worth to the team he had built. Number 3 is George Steinbrenner, the owner who wanted the same thing Munson wanted, a champion, but who fought his captain again and again over value, respect, and money. Steinbrenner bought the Yankees in 1973, and his ownership brought a demanding, corporate style into a clubhouse that had never seen anything like it before. Everything became a business decision, and every player, including the captain, had to justify his own worth in dollars and cents. Before Steinbrenner arrived, the Yankees had spent years struggling to reclaim their old glory, and the new owner made it clear from the very start that losing would no longer be tolerated in any form. He expected results immediately, and he was willing to spend heavily to get them, bringing in expensive talent whenever he believed it could push the team closer to a championship. That approach created constant pressure throughout the entire organization, from the front office all the way down to the clubhouse. Munson played through serious pain during these years. He caught games with damaged knees and broken fingers, absorbing the kind of physical punishment that wears down a catcher's body faster than almost any other position in baseball. He believed that his toughness, his heavy workload behind the plate, his role as captain, and his total loyalty to the organization deserved real financial recognition, not another fight at the negotiating table every single year. Munson had earlier agreed to a 5-year contract worth $250,000 a year, a very large sum at the time. Along with that deal came a verbal promise from Steinbrenner that Munson would remain the highest-paid player on the entire Yankees roster, no matter who else the team brought in down the road. For a while that promise held, and it gave Munson a sense that his sacrifice was being properly valued by the man at the top. He carried that promise with him through every tough game, every painful inning behind the plate, and every argument he had with Steinbrenner over smaller matters, trusting that at least on this one point, his position at the top of the payroll was secure and settled for good. Then Reggie Jackson signed a huge new deal with the Yankees, and his contract included larger overall value and heavy incentive bonuses that pushed his total pay above Munson's salary. Munson viewed this as a broken promise. Plain and simple. It did not matter to him that Jackson was a different kind of player facing a different kind of market. What mattered was that Steinbrenner had given his word, and that word had not held up when a bigger name walked through the door. Munson resented having to fight publicly for his own financial standing, especially after everything he had already given to this organization. He began to question whether the front office truly valued him the way it claimed to, or whether he was simply a useful piece to be paid whatever the moment required. That resentment did not fade quickly. It followed him through the rest of his career, coloring how he viewed nearly every decision that came out of the front office from that point forward. Even small moves by the organization, moves that had nothing to do with him personally, started to feel like fresh evidence that ownership cared more about splashy new names than about the captain who had bled for the team every single season. That kind of thinking hardened over time, turning a single broken promise into a lasting source of bitterness that shaped how Munson approached almost every conversation with the front office from then on. It is fair to be critical of Munson here, even though his anger is easy to understand. His frustration had a reasonable basis, since he had sacrificed his body and his privacy for this team for years. But he also allowed salary rank and public recognition to become deeply, almost obsessively personal. He let a number on a contract define his sense of his own worth, and that number sharpened his resentment toward both Steinbrenner and Jackson in ways that spilled over into the clubhouse, the press, and his own daily mood. Steinbrenner was not simply a cold businessman in all of this. The record shows that he held real, genuine affection for Munson's toughness and his leadership, and he valued having a captain willing to play hurt and hold teammates accountable without being asked. He saw in Munson the same hunger to win that drove his own decisions as an owner, and that shared hunger created a bond that went beyond any single contract dispute, even when the two men were not speaking warmly to one another. Their disagreements were real, but so was the underlying respect between them, a respect that outlasted every argument over a contract number or a broken promise. That respect showed itself clearly after Munson's death. Steinbrenner personally chartered a plane to fly the entire Yankees team, its coaches, and its top executives to Canton, Ohio, so the whole organization could attend the funeral together on August 6, 1979. It was a costly, deeply personal gesture from a man known mostly for his business instincts, a gesture that had nothing to do with dollars or contracts or the arguments the two men had shared over the years. It proved that the business conflict between owner and captain had never actually erased the human bond underneath it, no matter how many hard words had passed between them at the negotiating table. The contract promise Steinbrenner made and later failed to fully honor connects directly to the final name on this list, the man whose arrival caused the whole dispute in the first place. Before we get there, though, this story turns toward the most physical rivalry Munson ever fought, a feud that had nothing to do with contracts and everything to do with pride, territory, and the bitter hatred between two rival franchises fighting for the same division every single season. Number 2 brings us to Carlton Fisk, the Boston Red Sox catcher who stood as Munson's fiercest rival at his own position. This was, without question, the most openly physical rivalry on the entire list, one built on blood, bruises, and years of shared hatred between two proud men who each refused to lose to the other. Munson and Fisk were the two leading catchers in the American League during the 1970s, and they competed for everything the position had to offer. They fought for all-star selections year after year. They fought for Gold Glove awards. They fought for postseason success and for the simple right to be called the best catcher in the league. Their personal rivalry reflected something much larger, the historic hatred between the Yankees and the Red Sox that ran through the entire sport during this era. Both men were tough, proud, and completely unwilling to back down from any challenge that came their way, no matter how small. Statistics from their long careers help explain exactly why Munson believed he had earned the right to call himself the best. Munson won the 1970 Rookie of the Year award, while Fisk won the same honor 2 years later in 1972. Munson took home the 1976 American League Most Valuable Player award, an honor Fisk never captured, with his best finish coming in second place back in 1972. Munson finished his career with a .292 batting average, well ahead of Fisk's .269 mark. Munson won 3 straight Gold Glove awards, while Fisk won just 1. Both men also carried themselves the same way behind the plate, refusing to show weakness even after a hard collision or a foul tip off the mask. Pitchers on both teams trusted them completely, and both were viewed around the league as the emotional anchor of their entire pitching staff, the man who set the tone for every single game from the crouch behind home plate. Where the numbers tilt back toward Fisk is postseason volume and longevity. Fisk's much longer career in the majors produced far more total hits, home runs, and RBIs than Munson ever compiled, along with more all-star selections overall. But when the games mattered most, Munson's numbers shine brighter. He won 2 World Series championships, while Fisk appeared in just one, in 1975, without ever winning it. Munson hit .357 across 30 postseason games and an incredible .373 across 3 separate World Series appearances. Fisk's postseason numbers never came close to matching that kind of pressure performance. These numbers explain why Munson believed he had earned superiority over his rival, even while Fisk remained a constant threat to that claim every single season. The two men could not simply let the numbers settle the argument, though. Their rivalry boiled over into open violence more than once. And nothing captures that violence better than what happened on August 1st, 1973, at Fenway Park. The score was tied in the 9th inning that day. Yankees manager Ralph Hook called for a daring play, a suicide squeeze with Gene Michael at the plate. Michael swung and missed the pitch completely, leaving Munson exposed as he charged in hard from third base with nowhere to hide. Munson collided violently with Fisk at home plate, trying to knock the ball loose from his rival's grip through pure physical force. Fisk held onto the ball, tagged Munson out, and then shoved him hard to the ground in front of a packed Fenway Park crowd. Munson refused to accept the play calmly. He got back up and started a physical fight right there at home plate, and within seconds, players from both teams poured out of their dugouts, turning the moment into a full bench-clearing brawl. It was a stunning example of how quickly simple competition could turn into pure violence between these two men and these two teams. and it set the tone for years of hostility that followed. The violence returned less than 3 years later, on May 20th, 1976, at Yankee Stadium. This time it was Yankees outfielder Lou Piniella who collided with Fisk during a play at the plate. Once again, both benches emptied onto the field, and the fight left Red Sox pitcher Bill Lee with a shoulder injury that affected his season. Nothing in the record suggests that Munson personally started this second brawl, but it stands as further proof of the violent atmosphere that surrounded every meeting between these two rivals during this stretch of baseball history. The repeated physical clashes between these two catchers did more than fill highlight reels. They helped define an entire era of Yankees and Red Sox baseball, turning every regular season series between the two clubs into appointment viewing for fans who wanted to see whether the hatred would boil over again. Broadcasters began previewing these matchups specifically around the history between Munson and Fisk, treating their rivalry as its own storyline separate from the standings. Munson's hostility toward Boston never stayed limited to Fisk alone. He viewed slugger Jim Rice as a major power threat to Yankees' success, and he treated Carl Yastrzemski, Fred Lynn, Bill Lee, and Fisk together as symbols of the larger enemy standing between New York and the top of the American League East. Every game against Boston brought hard slides, close pitches, sharp verbal jabs, and intense gamesmanship, and Munson treated every single one of those games as if the whole season depended on the outcome. That hatred reached its greatest test on October 2nd, 1978, during the American League East tiebreaker game at Fenway Park. Bucky Dent delivered the moment most fans remember, a 3-run home run that shifted the entire game. But Munson played his own critical part, driving in Mickey Rivers with an 8th-inning RBI double that added a crucial run to the Yankees' lead. In the bottom of the 9th, with Boston threatening to tie the game, Lou Piniella tracked a line drive off the bat of Jim Rice through the blinding afternoon sun and somehow made the catch for the second out. Greg Nettles then caught a foul pop-up off the bat of Carl Yastrzemski to seal a 5-4 Yankees victory. That single game gave the whole ugly rivalry a real payoff, the kind of moment fans still talk about decades later whenever these two old rivals come up in conversation. Munson's hostility toward Boston could be bitter, even violent at times, but he also delivered when the rivalry reached its single greatest moment of pressure, helping secure one of the most famous wins in the history of this entire feud. Fisk was an enemy wearing the enemy's uniform, a threat that Munson could see coming from across the field every time these two teams met on the schedule. Their fights were loud, physical, and unmistakably public, playing out in front of packed stadiums and national television audiences. The final name on this list was different, and in many ways far more dangerous to Munson's pride. This man walked straight into Munson's own clubhouse wearing the very same pinstripes, and he threatened Munson's status from the inside in a way no outside rival like Fisk ever truly could. Number 1 is Reggie Jackson, and this rivalry stands above every other name on this list, because it combined every single source of Munson's anger into one relationship, wrapped inside a single uniform and a single locker room that both men had to share every single day for years. There is a real irony sitting at the start of this story. Munson himself was one of the people inside the organization who originally encouraged George Steinbrenner to pursue Jackson during the 1976 to 1977 offseason. Munson believed Jackson's raw power could turn the Yankees into a true championship team, and he was not wrong about the talent. But Jackson's arrival immediately disrupted the existing order of the clubhouse, an order that had Munson sitting comfortably at the very top as captain and reigning most valuable player. Jackson arrived instead as the expensive, highly publicized free agent star, and the whole balance of the team shifted overnight the moment his signing became official. Reporters flocked to cover his every move that spring, treating him as the biggest story in baseball, while Munson, the reigning captain and most valuable player, suddenly found himself sharing the spotlight with a player who had never worn Yankees pinstripes before that season. The salary issue came first in this whole saga, and it cut deep. Munson had a 5-year contract paying $250,000 a year, and Steinbrenner had personally told him he would remain the highest-paid player on the roster no matter what. Jackson's new deal exceeded that number and included heavy incentive bonuses on top of it. Munson saw this as pure disrespect, a broken promise delivered right in front of the entire team. The tension was never only about the raw dollar amount. It involved rank, attention, and control over the team's whole public identity, questions of who really mattered most inside that clubhouse. It would be unfair to simply declare that Munson was jealous or insecure, since nobody can truly read another man's private thoughts from the outside looking in. What the record does show clearly is that Munson's actions and his public complaints reflected wounded pride, real resentment, and anger over who held power in the clubhouse. power that had suddenly and painfully changed without his consent, an order he had spent years building through pain, sacrifice, and constant physical punishment behind the plate. That tension exploded into public view after an interview appeared in the May 1977 edition of Sport magazine. Journalist Robert Ward conducted the interview at the Banana Boat Lounge in Fort Lauderdale during spring training, sitting across from Jackson at a small table, while the rest of the team prepared for the coming season just a short distance away. The resulting article rattled the entire Yankees clubhouse the moment it hit newsstands across the country. Jackson described himself in the piece as the straw that stirs the drink, a phrase that instantly became famous across the sports world. The article also presented Jackson as directly diminishing Munson's own importance to the team, suggesting that the captain simply could not fill that same central role. Jackson later disputed the exact circumstances and accuracy of the quotation in his own autobiography, saying the moment had been shaped in ways he did not fully control, but the printed words had already done their damage by the time any correction arrived. The fallout was immediate, and it was ugly. The comments caused a genuine crisis inside the clubhouse, one that went far beyond a passing disagreement between two stars who simply did not get along. Teammates were forced to pick sides, or at least to navigate around two of the biggest personalities in the entire sport while trying to stay focused on winning games. Munson believed that Jackson had disrespected both the captain's title and every other player who had helped build the team before Jackson ever arrived in pinstripes. During a nationally televised broadcast of ABC's Superstars competition, Munson and Greg Nettles publicly snubbed Jackson together, refusing to give him the basic respect most teammates extend to one another in front of cameras. The relationship between the two stars stayed cold for a long stretch after that, and their conflict became one of the most talked about clubhouse rivalries in the entire history of baseball. Looking at this critically, Munson's sense of ownership over the clubhouse made real compromise almost impossible. Public disrespect from Jackson did not excuse every one of Munson's own cold responses, and Munson's need to control the emotional center of that team meant he struggled to share the spotlight with anyone, even a teammate wearing the exact same uniform and chasing the exact same championship. Yet, something more complicated grew between these two men over time. Munson and Jackson eventually developed a functional, working professional relationship built on one shared trait that mattered more than any personal grudge: a burning desire to win. Both men cared deeply about championships, and both were willing to set aside their differences when the games actually started. That shared drive produced one of the most unforgettable moments in World Series history. A real championship, delivered by a talented, difficult, and unforgettable Yankees team that fought each other almost as hard as they fought their opponents. Looking back across this whole list, the pattern becomes clear. Munson clashed with a teammate who mostly agreed with him, a manager who trusted him completely, an owner who genuinely cared about him, a rival who wore an enemy's uniform, and finally a teammate who threatened him from within his own clubhouse. Each relationship tested a different part of his pride, and each one revealed just how much Munson demanded from the people around him, whether they wore the same uniform or stood across the diamond as his sworn enemy, and whether they had earned his trust over many years or arrived overnight with a single record-setting contract. What ties every single name on this countdown together is not simple hatred. It is the sheer intensity Munson brought to every relationship in his baseball life, an intensity that could build a champion and wound a friend in the very same season, sometimes within the very same week, and sometimes over the very same argument that never fully went away. All of that constant fire came at a real cost. Munson frequently treated reporters with open hostility, calling print journalists leeches and often refusing interviews altogether after tough losses or tough personal weeks. His difficult, complicated relationship with the press may have quietly harmed his Hall of Fame support in later years, since many voting writers carried their own memories of his short temper into the ballot box. His death at age 32 also left him short of the career totals voters usually expect from a catcher. But the story does not end there, and it should not end there either. Munson died on August 2, 1979, while practicing landings in his own aircraft. The Yankees organization traveled together to his funeral in Canton, Ohio, standing united in a moment of real grief. Lou Piniella and Bobby Mercer delivered the eulogies that day, speaking for a team that had lost far more than a captain. That very same afternoon, the Yankees returned to New York to play the Baltimore Orioles in a nationally televised game. Bobby Mercer, who had given a tearful eulogy just hours earlier, hit a 3-run home run and then added a 2-run walk-off single, leading his team to a 5-4 victory in front of a stunned and grieving crowd. Mercer gave the bat from that game to Munson's widow, Diana, and he never used it again. Munson's own peak production still compares favorably with several catchers already enshrined in the Hall of Fame. His postseason batting average sat at an incredible .3 FOBI7 across 30 games, and his World Series batting average reached .373 across 3 separate championship runs against tough pitching. He remains tied forever to real toughness, to accountability, and to championship leadership, the same qualities that made him so difficult for the 5 men on this list to fully embrace. Thurman Munson was proud, demanding, and often harsh with the people closest to him. He picked fights he did not need to pick, and he held grudges longer than he probably should have. But those very same stubborn traits, the refusal to back down, and the relentless demand for excellence from everyone around him, helped make him the true emotional center of a Yankees team that won when it mattered most. Thurman Munson was hard to live with, but when the game was on the line, he was a captain worth following.